In the second half of the 20th century, English poetry went through an extraordinary transformation. In the aftermath of war, new kinds of poets emerged who took poetry from a scholarly elite and turned it into an art form for everyone. They found a powerful new language and laid bare the torments of the modern soul. Poets from America brought a direct style of performance to resonate with a new audience.
Yes! I am that worm soul under the heel of the demon horses.
And as poets caught the public eye, the cameras of the BBC brought their work into millions of living rooms. From Philip Larkin, who captured the spirit of 50s Britain,
Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence,
to Sylvia Plath, who gate-crashed the all-male club of poetry in English.
Dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well.
To Seamus Heaney, the Irish farmer's son who found readers all over the world. There were new voices from outside the mainstream and prophets of the counterculture.
I think everybody ought to take LSD and get rid of their violence and their color and their identity and, like, get with it finally and stop making such a big, noisy scene.
Together, they voiced what it was like to live in the modern age. This is how they did it, in their own words. Britain in the 1950s. A country still recovering from war. A country rebuilding itself and ready for change. The ambitious elder statesmen of English poetry, such as T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, felt like giants from a previous age.
I think poetry after the Second World War had lost a lot of its confidence, and I think that the sort of ground was open for voices to come in and be heard.
There's been a great tradition in 20th century poetry of issuing manifestos. So each generation comes along, issues a manifesto saying those lot before us are rubbish. Now it's our turn.
True to form, in 1956 a group of up-and-coming poets were all published together in a brand new anthology and became known informally as the Movement. Reacting against the obscure experiments of modernism, these writers used traditional verse forms and a wry everyday language.
The early poetry of those writers was full of observation and anecdote, and often observation and anecdote drawn from the daily lives of the poets, which meant the daily lives of the readers too.
The Movement was made up of mostly male white-collar workers, including librarian Philip Larkin and university lecturer Kingsley Amis.
When you have movements and generations and little collectives, there's always one person that stands out, really, and it's around them everything revolves. And in the case of those 50s poets, it's Larkin.
Philip Larkin was affectionately known as the Hermit of Hull. Though he won critical acclaim in his 30s, he shunned the limelight for a quiet career as a university librarian for over 3 decades. But in 1964, he allowed himself to be filmed for the BBC's flagship arts programme, Monitor.
Work and I get on fairly well, I think. There are just these occasions when one would like to prove it by not working for a bit. When I bind up library committee minutes at the end of 5 years, it makes a great fat volume. But it's not the same as a volume of poetry.
Larkin was always described to me at school as the voice of the man next door. He didn't sound like the man who lived next door to me, but I understand where that comment comes from. There's a sense of him describing the daily, the ordinary, the domestic. It was a language that came out of the bus stop and the newspaper, transformed through his poetic powers.
When getting my nose in a book cured most things short of school, it was worth ruining my eyes to know I could still keep cool and deal out the old right hook to dirty dogs twice my size. Later, with inch-thick specs, evil was just my lark. Me and my cloak and fangs had ripping times in the dark. The women I clubbed with sex. I broke them up like meringues. Don't read much now. The dude who lets the girl down before the hero arrives, the chap who's yellow and keeps the store, seem far too familiar. Get stewed. Books are a load of crap.
The striking thing about Larkin's poetry is in a way, its eloquent ordinariness. You can analyse as much as you want his poetry in terms of sort of the nerves it touches and the experiences of sort of welfare state Britain, life in the post-war world that it illuminates, and that's all true. But in the end, it's his gift for memorable phrases and lines.
He had a tendency to send himself up, rather. So when he appears on camera, he is, in a way, playing a kind of a part.
I read that, you know, I'm a miserable sort of fellow writing a kind of welfare state sub-poetry. Doing it well, perhaps, but it isn't really what poetry is, and it isn't really the sort of poetry we want. But I wonder whether it ever occurs to the writer of criticism like that really one agrees with them. But what one writes is based so much on the kind of person one is and the kind of environment one's had and has now that one doesn't really choose the poetry one writes. One writes the kind of poetry one has to write or can write.
Living on the margins suited Larkin. His writing captured a remote awkwardness with the world around him.
He's always very keen to make us understand that sense of separation, partly because we all feel it. It's particularly powerful, I think, in church-going, where you get that self-irony of him taking off his bicycle clips because he feels there's something about it. You just shouldn't be in a church with bicycle clips on. It's somehow disrespectful.
Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence, move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new. Cleaned or restored? Someone would know, I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce "Ya endeth" much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for.
When we want to go back and look at what it was like to live in those post-war years, Larkin's a very good place to go and find out, you know, the flavour and the vibe of that world.
Although he wrote just 4 slim volumes of poems in his lifetime, Larkin remains one of the greatest and most popular poets of the 20th century. If Larkin was the eccentric loner of the movement, writer and lifelong friend Kingsley Amis was its very public face. Frequently appearing on television, he would become the most outspoken member of the group. On the BBC, Amis voiced his disappointment with the conservatism of 50s Britain.
I personally then was suffering from a good deal of depression over quite a long time over the results of the 1951 election, which seemed to me to say that the modest bit of social revolution that the British might have been going in for between 1945 and 1951 had now come to an end, and the public had turned their back on that and were trying to reverse the process, which I found depressing.
Kingsley Amis was kind of associated with the angry young men. He was never really angry, I don't think, Kingsley Amis, but he did like to provoke, saying, you know, Eliot and Picasso are rubbish, but it's an act, you know, it's a pose.
Although Amis was most successful as a novelist, most famously for Lucky Jim in 1954, he actually began his career as a poet.
I think Kingsley Amis would see himself as a light verse poet. He edited an anthology of light verse. He enjoyed making people laugh.
Lucky Jim, how I envy him. Author, poet, fellow of Peterhouse, Cambridge, jazz critic. You ask what his name is? I say Kingsley Amis.
Well, the first poem is on an ever-interesting topic, though you might not think so to start with.
There's a poem of his called A Bookshop Idyll, which sort of looks at the differences between what men read and what women read. But interestingly, it's a poem that turns everything on its head at the end and admits that actually men have got a softer side too.
Should poets bicycle pump the human heart or squash it flat? Man's love is of man's life a thing apart. Girls aren't like that. We men have got love well weighed up. Our stuff can get by without it. Women don't seem to think that's good enough. They write about it. And the awful way their poems lay them open just doesn't strike them. Women are really much nicer than men. No wonder we like them. Deciding this, we can forget those times we sat up half the night, chock full of love, crammed with bright thoughts, names, rhymes, and couldn't write.
Having criticised his elitist predecessors, Amis made a virtue of his lower middle-class credentials, seeing himself as a voice for the ordinary man. But he and the other movement poets soon settled into the establishment.
If you look at photos now of those poets from the 50s, you know, I'm afraid there's a good degree of tweed jackets. They don't seem the sort of common men, the ordinary chaps that they, at the time they did, and as they saw themselves. But they were certainly cared about their audience. It's just that I think their audience in the end was other chaps like them.
By the 1960s, Britain, to some, seemed in danger of being left behind by a new kind of poetry coming from America. In 1962, the influential British critic Al Alvarez published an anthology promoting American poets. In an anxious world coming to terms with the Holocaust and potential atomic warfare, Alvarez' The New Poetry was a reaction against the safe, insular concerns of the movement. Instead, he championed a group of pioneering writers in the US, leading the way.
These poets started to feel that the British tradition was suffocating. The kind of stylized and formalized language of the Victorians really needs to be left behind, and poetry needs to get to grips with everyday life. And it needs to find the music in everyday life. It needs to bring in colloquial and idiomatic language.
John Berryman was part of this new set of American writers, who together were often called the confessional poets. Haunted for life by his father's suicide, John Berryman was a classically trained but troubled talent. Alvarez went to meet him in 1967 for the BBC, where he was writing his poems in a Dublin pub, which was apparently where he did most of his writing and a lot of his drinking.
My feelings about Yeats were quite queer. I didn't want to be like Yeats. I wanted to be Yeats. But that failed. You can see why that failed.
Berryman was talking about nervous breakdown and suicide attempts, madness, despair, alcoholism, and so forth.
Sometimes it's exhilarating and exciting to read. Sometimes you don't know where to look. And a lot of people were really turned off and horrified. I thought it was sort of vulgar.
Poets don't get very much fan mail. But I had a lot of mail after I published this song in the United States. I may say that the mail was entirely hostile. Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. After all, the sky flashes, the great sea yearns, we ourselves flash and yearn, and moreover, my mother told me as a boy, repeatingly, ever to confess you're bored means you have no inner resources. I conclude now, I have no inner resources.
Berryman grew up in an age which saw a rise in the culture of psychoanalysis in the US after the war. Inspired by Freud, and often in therapy themselves, he and his peers were reassessing the world around them, but also the world within.
I'm thinking especially of two books, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life and The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. Nobody, in the first place, everybody has to have read those books, you see. And in the second place, nobody's feelings about human experience are quite the same after reading those books.
The Dream Songs was Berryman's Pulitzer Prize-winning collection of poems, where an extreme alter ego called Henry lives out one nightmare of guilt and self-loathing after another.
When he started out as a poet, he was kind of rather stiff and repressed in that 50s way. Then he discovers in the Dream Songs and through the creation of this character, Henry, a new way of writing, a new way of exploring himself while wearing a mask.
He takes one step back from his mania, his alcoholism, his suicidal tendencies, his impossible to live withness, but just one step, and sees himself. And so it's sort of objectified, but at the same time, as a reader, we absolutely know that it's him.
But never did Henry, as he thought he did, end anyone and hacks your body up and hide the pieces where they may be found. He knows. He went over everyone and nobody's missing.
It was deeply appealing because it was so frank and honest and slightly scary. There's something wonderful about somebody saying something that you wouldn't dare to say yourself.
Berryman had a pretty chaotic lifestyle. You know, there was heavy drinking, a lot of despair, a lot of unhappy relationships, and it all ended in suicide. Something about writing in an orderly 50s way did not allow him to address that realm of experience.
In 1972, after writing a total of 385 dream songs, Berryman killed himself by jumping off a bridge in Minneapolis during the middle of winter. The confessional generation of writers redefined a modern voice in poetry, which could discuss any topic, no matter how personal or painful.
Poetry has always drawn on autobiography, but the notion of confessional poetry is the idea that these poets have shameful secrets that they're going to reveal. And that crosses a line for some people into the lurid, the tabloid, and revealing things that really it would be better to keep private.
One Bostonian who took this frank form of poetry to its extremes was former model-turned-writer Anne Sexton. Sexton took up writing in the pre-feminist culture of America in the 1950s. Her work was shockingly honest and informed by her battles with mental illness.
You know, although I did get very manic once, and they told me I was psychotic in the hospital, and I thought that was a riot, because I was still me. You know, I thought psychotic was someplace else, but I was still me.
Sexton, more than anybody else, wrote about previously taboo subjects in her poetry. She wrote about menstruation. She wrote about masturbation. She wrote about incest. She wrote about adultery. And she wrote about them in ways that suggested that she was not imagining that these were things she had intimate personal experience.
Menstruation at 40. I was thinking of a son. The womb is not a clock nor a bell tolling, but in the 11th month of its life, I feel the November of the body, as well as of the calendar. In 2 days, it will be my birthday, and as always, the earth is done with its harvest. This time, I hunt for death.
Poetry had always been pretty. It was supposed to be beautiful, and she was forcing in subject matter that was definitionally ugly.
It was in the womb all along. I was thinking of a son, you, the never acquired, the never seeded or unfastened, you of the genitals I feared, the stalk in the puppy's breath.
It was at the suggestion of Sexton's therapist that she began writing poetry. She was what we would now call bipolar, at the time called manic depressive, and it was suggested to her that poetry might help her in a therapeutic way. Many people have tried to write poetry in therapy, and Sexton wrote very great poetry.
And my psychiatrist suggested that I watch Channel 2. You have an educational television there. Why don't you look at it? So I did, and I.A. Richards was explaining the form of a sonnet, and I thought, oh, so that's a sonnet. So I sat down and tried to write one. It was a pretty bad thing. And that just turned me on, and then I, turned on.
Eventually, it became impossible to separate Sexton from her intensely autobiographical work.
She has a role she sees for herself, and she insists on playing it. And I just got sick of it, the endless posturing and just thinking, I don't want to go on any more about female stuff. I don't want to be wombing and entrailing all over the place and all that stuff. And I just wanted to go for a walk.
I myself will die without baptism, a third daughter they didn't bother. My death will come on my name day. What's wrong with the name day? It's only an angel of the sun. Woman, weaving a web over your own, a thin and tangled poison. Scorpio, bad spider, die.
The raw immediacy of Anne Sexton's writing won her continued attention until her suicide in 1974.
It may seem remarkable that so many of the important poets of the 20th century also had very troubled personal lives. Many of them, in fact, committed suicide. There's a real sense that being a great poet in the 20th century is pretty hard to survive.
But the most famous of the American poets from this movement would only be celebrated after her untimely death. And she would secure her lasting place in poetry back in Britain.
What an extraordinary breakthrough Sylvia Plath was to all of us who'd never read any women poets, really, that shook us to bits. Along came Plath, and God, who is this powerful, blazing woman?
Sylvia Plath remains one of the most remarkable female poets of the last 100 years. She gave women permission to express certain kinds of emotions and experiences that had never been put into poetry before.
In the autumn of 1962, at her home in North London, Sylvia Plath began to write Ariel, the collection of poems that would make her name.
Stasis in darkness, then the substanceless blue pour of tour and distances. God's lioness, how one we grow. Pivot of heels and knees, the furrow splits and passes, sister to the brown arc of the neck I cannot catch.
Those last poems in Ariel are just spat out. They come out at such a rate, and they're so intense and concentrated. This is really special.
Plath never appeared on television. In this radio recording in her final months, she stressed her preference for intellectual rigour over a poetry of self-pity.
I think my poems come immediately out of the sensuous and emotional experiences I have, but I must say I cannot sympathize with these cries from the heart that are informed by nothing except, you know, a needle or a knife or whatever it is. I believe that one should be able to control and manipulate experiences, even the most terrifying, like madness, being tortured, this sort of experience. That one should be able to manipulate these experiences with an informed and intelligent mind.
Despite the dark and tormented subject matter of her writing, Plath led an outwardly traditional life as a wife and mother, married to fellow poet Ted Hughes. A rare interview of them together captured a moment of domestic harmony.
I think our domestic life is practically indistinguishable from all the people who live around us. The only main difference is that Ted doesn't go out to work at 9 and come home at 5. He retires about 9 to his room and works. But I certainly have a life just like all the other housewives and mothers in our district, and shopping dishes and taking care of the baby and so forth. And I think very few people have an idea I do anything at all except household chores.
Would you say that your temperaments are parallel, or do you think they're in conflict?
I think superficially we're very alike. We like the same things. We live at the same tempo. But obviously this is a very fortunate covering for temperaments that are extremely different.
In spite of the appearance of a happy marriage, Plath had struggled with depression from her late teens. Her mother, Aurelia, was interviewed by the BBC.
I was constantly asking her to make choices, not to accept every opportunity that came along. I felt that she was pushing herself hard, and I was always fearful, especially after her first breakdown, that she was pushing herself and too demanding of herself.
She had to be the perfect American housewife, the perfectly beautifully groomed wife, a perfect housewife. She also had to be the most brilliant poet of her generation. And I mean, something's got to give, hasn't it? I mean, it is tragic.
In her poem Lady Lazarus, Plath reflected on her several suicide attempts.
I have done it again. 1 year in every 10 I manage it. Dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I've a call. It's easy enough to do it in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It's the theatrical comeback in broad day to the same place, the same face, the same brute, amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out.
In the early hours of the 23rd of February 1963, during one of the coldest English winters ever, Plath committed suicide by placing her head in a gas oven. She was 30 years old.
Lines that have haunted me that were taken from Ariel, from the poem called The Elm. Just Elm, I think. I am inhabited by a cry. Nightly it flaps out, looking with its hooks for something to love.
Plath mythologized her personal life in her writing, investing aspects of her emotional biography with profound dramatic significance. When her final poems were published posthumously in Ariel in 1965, Plath became one of the most significant voices of the 20th century, not simply for poetry, but also for women.
She gets classed as a feminist poet, whether she'd like it or not. So we keep treating her as a feminist martyr. That's to uncomplicate a very complicated person. No one could get it right with Sylvia. and the feminists would have been in just as much trouble as everybody else. I kind of wish that Sylvia had written a poem about feminists in which she got truly stuck into them. But of course she didn't.
Although often remembered as the super couple of modern English poetry, Plath and Hughes' styles were completely different from each other. Unlike his urban contemporaries, Yorkshireman Ted Hughes was unfashionably obsessed with nature.
He wanted to re-engage with the elemental forces, with some fairly, primitive notions.
Who is stronger than hope? Death. Who is stronger than the will? Death. Stronger than love? Death. Stronger than life? Death. But who is stronger than death? Me, evidently. Pass, Crow.
Most other poets at that time were urban, academic, erudite voices of professors and newspaper people. In that context, he was a kind of backwoodsman speaking a kind of agricultural version of the Bible, and his mood and manner were at variance with what was going on in the poetic community at the time, and I think for that reason they stood out right from the beginning.
Nature for him was violent and dark and brutal in a way that no nature poetry had previously acknowledged. So he created his own kind of natural universe.
Pike, 3 inches long, perfect pike in all parts, green tigering the gold. Killers from the egg, the malevolent aged grin. They dance on the surface among the flies, or move, stunned by their own grandeur, over a bed of emerald, silhouette of submarine delicacy and horror, 100 feet long in their world.
In comparison with a lot of other poets who were, talking about bicycle clips and statues in churches, Hughes, must have seemed rough and tough. Larkin, not to his face, described Hughes as the Incredible Hulk.
There was really no love lost between Philip Larkin and Ted Hughes. Larkin said in his letters that he thought Hughes's poems were embarrassing. And when Hughes turned up to give a talk at Hull University, Larkin says he was like a Christmas present from Easter Island because of this great hewn face of his.
A charismatic presence and eventual poet laureate, Hughes was a private person and very reluctant to appear on screen. But the relationship of poets to their audiences was about to undergo a dramatic change. The counterculture of the 1960s was transforming America. It was a time of free love, political activism, and experimentation. And poets were taking a leading role.
There was a sort of San Francisco explosion. It feels something new and exciting because they're prepared to write about taboo subjects.
The poets of the Beat generation, whose leading light was Allen Ginsberg, enchanted and scandalized with their revolutionary approach to writing.
Beat poets made quite an impression on a lot of us at the time. I remember buying a book, and then inside all these photographs of all these different cafes in San Francisco and in New York, all these poets reading to enrapt audiences. And I remember, because the audience, the front row, all these beautiful girls, looking at the poet. And I thought, that's for me. I'll be a poet.
When Ginsberg arrived in London, he was met with a storm of publicity never seen before for a poet. An openly gay intellectual and committed Buddhist, Allen Ginsberg was the most outspoken and political member of the Beats. Despite attacking America's conservatism, he believed in change through spiritual or peaceful means. During his visit, he took part in a discussion on violence for the BBC's Panorama programme.
When you are in America and you see the Negro problem in full spate with its non-violent and violent manifestations, how do you react? From your...
I think everybody ought to take LSD and get rid of their violence and their color and their identity and, get with it finally and stop making such a big, noisy scene.
There comes a point in 20th century poetry where poets put themselves to the foreground. They reveal who they are, they do lots of interviews, they come on stage and they do stuff between the poems. The purists hate this because the poem is supposed to be kind of sacred and stand on its own, but certainly for the last 30 or 40 years we've had poets who who show all, and Ginsberg is somebody like that.
Ginsberg's poems railed against the conformity of modern America, dealing frankly with taboo subjects like homosexuality and drug addiction. His most famous work, Howl, was a 30-minute outpouring of rage, which was put on trial after publication for obscenity.
We all used to pass around Howl. A lot of people were influenced by it because it was a howl. It was a cry of pain. It was a cry of something or other about. It seemed to be drug-fueled and daring. All these things that we weren't. I was never drug-filled and daring. If only.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, who howled on their knees in the subway and were dragged off the roof, waving genitals and manuscripts, who let themselves be fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy.
Interviewed on the BBC's Face to Face several decades later, Ginsberg looked back on his scandalous work.
It wasn't long before in your poems you were willing to make explicit statements about your sexuality.
Yes.
Wasn't that very difficult in what was, after all, McCarthy's America?
Well, it would have been if I had intended it to be public, but to tell you the truth, and as I've said before, Howl was written sort of in despair at writing poetry. I figured I hadn't succeeded in writing anything interesting. And so I said, well, then I'll just write writing for myself and I'll forget about any idea of publishing poetry. And when it got to my own got fucked in the ass by handsome sailors and screamed with joy, rather than screamed with pain or agony, I realized how funny it was, but I knew that my father would not want to read that. So from then on, I knew I wouldn't be able to publish the poem. And so I was completely free to write anything I wanted.
Inspired by Ginsberg, live readings had become a key part of the newly energised poetry scene. In the summer of 1965, the BBC captured a unique moment when poetry readings outgrew the coffee houses and bookshops for London's Royal Albert Hall. And Ginsberg was the headline act, performing to 7,000 fans.
Going to watch Ginsberg in the Albert Hall was one thing, and that was exciting. And there was a lot of marijuana smoke going around. And it was like California or New York comes to London, you know.
Yes! I am that worm soul under the heel of the demon horses. I am that man trembling to die in vomit and trance in bamboo eternities, belly ripped open by red hand of courteous Chinaman kids. Come sweetly now back to myself as I was.
Poets began to discover the shamanistic tradition of performance. If he became possessed, the audience would become possessed, there would be a transformation of some kind. All poets are interested in transformation. Will I be transformed by writing it? Will the audience be transformed by listening to it?
No! I've been home for months, but not all of me. Somewhere beyond the seas, the spies in their spinach tint suits are watching the movies unwind with owlish X-ray stares there on the screen, blue light on the couch. You sit smiling at me and stretching your arms, and he couldn't make it.
Ginsberg seemed to feel very strongly that if he acted as the shaman, as the prophet, then people would listen, and that would deconstruct America as this great military-industrial complex, pursuing minorities, being racist and sexist, and pursuing people who want to smoke dope. And so he raged against it and hoped that people would join him in what was really a kind of poetic, shamanistic campaign.
One of them grunting, one of them groaning out, "What a chick."
A lot of people have been concerned recently about the rise in poetry, particularly amongst teenagers. Slim volumes can now be bought openly in certain parts of the country, and it has become fashionable for people to gather together in groups and be turned on by verse.
If San Francisco was the vibrant heart of the beats scene, in Britain, Liverpool was where it was all happening. Inspired by California's brand of direct performance poetry, a group of young men were about to play their part in the city's cultural revolution.
When the Liverpool poets came out in the mid-60s, it was a breath of fresh air. Liverpool was the place of the Beatles and this brand new explosion of working class culture into British life.
They seem to have incorporated something of the Beatles' sense of irreverence.
The Liverpool poets were geography graduate turned pop star Roger McGough music journalist Brian Patton and artist Adrian Henry. Together they would bring poetry, like art and music, into the heart of 60s pop culture. The BBC filmed the group of pop poets on location in 1966 at Liverpool's Everyman Theatre. But it was McGough who would develop as the main voice of the movement.
Monica, the tea things are taking over. The cups are as big as bubble cars, they throttle around the room. Tin openers skate on the greasy plates by the light of the silvery moon. The biscuits are having a party, they're necking in our bread bin. That's jazz you hear in the salt cellars, but they don't let non-members in. The egg spoons had our eggs for breakfast. The sauce bottles asleep in our bed. I overheard the knives and forks. It won't be long, they said. It won't be long, they said.
In 1967, the hugely influential Mersey Sound was published and became Britain's best-selling poetry anthology of the time.
I remember finding Roger McGough's Let Me Die a Young Man's Death, Not a Clean and In Between the Sheets, Holy Water Death. I remember reading it in the Sunday Times one Sunday and thinking, wow, I want to do that.
I think any poet or group of poets who do something new or newish in poetry, they give permission to others to think, oh, well, I could write like that. I think that's wonderful. I think that's the democratic pulse that runs through poetry.
They were part of the new revival of poetry, of the poetry reading and doing it out loud and making it make sense. You know, they really were just the game changers.
The Queen came up to Liverpool to dine at our town hall. In the evening wrote to her husband, Dear Philip, I'm having a ball. I think I'll hang about, everything's happening here. I'm beginning to dig the poetry scene and the ale is bloody gear. So while she was having a castle built down in Castle Street, she had a look round Liverpool 8, found a pad there, small but neat. She moved in a few belongings, corgis, crowns, a throne. And the blue blood in the neighbourhood really raised the tone.
It seemed very near and seemed very approachable, and yet when you look at it now, in some respects, of course, it was very formal poetry. There they are in little four-line verses, rhyming perfectly. So it was magical.
Out of work, divorced, usually pissed. He aimed low in life and missed.
But McGough's popular approach met a critical backlash.
If you write about ordinary stuff, and if you write about things that other poets have written about in quite highfalutin ways, and you write about it in very ordinary ways, people will treat you with disdain.
There was still a lot of hostility towards the Liverpool poets. Poets found it unbearable. They do, if somebody comes along who's popular.
I mean, I once read a review that was outrageous. I mean, it was just as if somehow or other he had profaned poetry. He hasn't at all. He's done the opposite. He's kept it alive.
What do you think the role of the poet is, or your poetry?
I don't quite know, really. I think there are two things. I think there are two reasons for writing it. I'm not quite sure why one writes poetry. It's something very personal. But then when you actually stand and read it to people, then I think it possibly can be entertaining. The choice of poems should be entertaining.
But do you see yourself as an entertainer?
Not in the sense of like a show business sort of thing. Not that really. I think it's all sorts of things. You know, it can be serious, can be entertaining, can be funny, and all these. I think entertaining tends to mean funny. I think that's the problem. In people's minds.
He's behind you! Chorused the children. But the warning came too late. The monster leapt forward and, fastening its teeth into his neck, tore off the head. The body fell to the floor. More, cried the children, more.
Poetry had become a familiar part of popular entertainment and was reaching a wider audience than ever before. But in the mid-1970s, at a time of deep social unrest in Britain, more urgent, marginalised voices started to be heard. Dub poet Linton Kwesi Johnson was one of the first people to write about the situation for the disaffected black British youth living in the inner cities.
He was the only voice that was speaking to us, putting our situation under a microscope, and not only just reporting and observing, but kind of offering direction and ideas. You know, you look at the body of his work, and he sums up the 70s into the early 80s, what it was like to be black in Britain, like nobody else.
Madness, madness tight on the heads of the rebels. The bitterness erupts like a hot glass, broke glass. Rituals of blood under burning.
Kwesi Johnson wrote in a Jamaican dialect and performed his poems over reggae beats.
Broke glass, cold blades as sharp as the eyes of hate and the stabbings. It's war amongst the rebels.
One of the fibs about British poetry is that it's always been written in standard English. The point is, many poets, both in Britain and America, have written in what you might call non-standard or in dialect. So when Linton was writing in patois, people said, oh, well, I don't understand it. I think they were making a statement that they didn't want to understand it.
Steel blade drinking blood in darkness. It's war amongst the rebels. Madness, madness, war.
Kwesi Johnson's unique style of performance attracted the curiosity of even the most traditional BBC programmes.
You do use a Creole patois, don't you, which is very difficult for a white person to understand. I found, listening to some of them, that I would like to have understood them more than I did, and that in a way you weren't actually reaching me as a white person.
Well, perhaps it forces you, if you're really that interested, you know, to try and penetrate the language and check it out and try and understand it.
But would you not also like the white people to understand a little bit of what the black people are going through?
Sure, and I think some people do get some insights into our experiences from our poetry.
We looked to our language and the way we delivered our language as part of our rebelliousness. You know, our parents, you know, when they came over in the mid-50s, the way that they thought they'd succeed was by assimilating, which, you know, really meant trying to play the white man. I mean, you know, Jamaican language, it's got a bass, man, you know what I mean? It's got a certain power to it.
So smooth, so tight and ripe and smash.
You like also to perform your poems, don't you, rather than to actually have people read them?
Absolutely, because it's oral poetry. The emphasis is on the spoken word as opposed to the written word. And, of course, the spoken word has a greater immediacy and impact than the written word does.
Published in the run-up to the Brixton riots of the early 80s, Dread, Beat and Blood became Kwesi Johnson's politically charged anthem to his generation's struggle with police brutality and injustice.
Dread, Beat and Blood is a really powerful piece of work that's definitely informed by the times, and I don't think there's a better encapsulation of what the black British experience was at that time. I mean, it certainly changed my life.
The BBC Arts documentary strand Omnibus followed Kwesi Johnson's campaign for George Lindo, a black British man who had been wrongfully imprisoned for robbery.
The slogans that the demonstrators were chanting had a kind of a calypso tempo. Jail house, ain't George house. Jail house, ain't George house. And that simple chant gave me the inspiration to write this poem.
Them frame up George Lindo up in Bradford town. With the Bradford blacks, them a rally round. Maggie Thatcher on the go with a racist show. But a she have to go. Cause right now, African, Asian, West Indian, and black British stand firm in England in this year time here. George Lindo, he no carry no dagger George Lindo. Him is not no robber George Lindo. Them have to let him go George Lindo. Them better free him.
From the streets of Brixton to the libraries of Hull to the living rooms of suburban America, poetry had sprung from some unfamiliar places. And over the course of the century, poetry had been transformed, no longer the preserve of a privileged few, but a diverse community of voices. At the end of the century, there would be one writer who would enjoy universal appeal and become one of modern poetry's household names. Like many of the poets of his generation, he was an outsider, growing up on a cattle farm in rural Northern Ireland. Seamus Heaney, or as he became known, Famous Seamus.
There are two ways to look at Seamus Heaney's early poetry, and indeed English writers did look at them in these two ways. One, to think it's wonderful about nature, and two, to think it's rural, earthy, it's all about root vegetables and crops and so on. Both, actually, reactions are rather condescending to what Heaney was actually doing. Heaney's so-called nature poetry is actually dealing with a lot of other things to do with identity, his own, to do with family and tribe and home and belonging. It's not just about describing blackberries or potatoes.
The coarse boot nestled on the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. My God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Heaney began his 45-year-long career writing about his modest farming background. His first collection, Death of a Naturalist, published in 1966, was an instant success.
As a child, they couldn't keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus, and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted board top. I savoured the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it.
The magic of poetry is that the individual can take an experience, paint it in words, and other people can see themselves in it. He's not about anything. There's no polemic in his poetry.
Now, to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed Narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing.
He came from nowhere and nothing. There was no literary sort of pedigree in Heaney's background. You know, from a farming family in rural Ireland. I think it coincided with a more general movement in poetry through the late 20th century, where those voices from the outside, you know, the non-metropolitan voices, became more interesting. You know, these were people who often hadn't had a voice.
Heaney grew up in a rural community, and that was his world, and the world that he wrote about in his first 2 or 3 collections. But then he was living in Belfast at the time of the Troubles. Suddenly, the urgency of that matter was something he felt he had to address as a poet, to be a public voice, to be a political voice, to show solidarity with his own people.
Interviewed on the BBC in 1973, at the height of the Northern Irish conflict, Heaney was forced to consider how he would play a public role.
In your early years, your first poetry, wrote what I'd call modern landscape poetry, basically, of the land. And now that landscape that you're all too familiar with is torn by often arbitrary but certainly tormenting violence. Surely this must have some effect on the poetry you're writing now.
My view and way with poetry has never been to use it as a vehicle for making statements about situations. The poems have more come up like bodies out of the bog of my own imagination. I want to wait, in a sense, until the violence comes out of the pores of my mind, naturally. I think it does, in a way, but...
Well, I notice a discernible movement in that direction and a feeling of the symbols coming to you, which you're selecting in the poem in dedication in your last book, Wintering Out, which I'll read. This morning, from a dewy motorway, I saw the new camp for the internees. A bomb had left a crater of fresh clay in the roadside, and over in the trees, machine gun posts defined a real stockade. There was that white mist you get on a low ground, and it was déjà vu, some film made of Stalag 17, a bad dream with no sound. Is there a life before death? That's chalked up on a wall downtown. Competence with pain, coherent miseries, a bite and sup. We hug our little destiny again.
I think it well may happen in the future, now that sadly he's gone, that his affability is not the thing he would be remembered for, but actually the toughness of his language.
It's always hard to know which poets will endure, which ones will speak to generations after ours, but I hope Heaney's will, I think it will. And in the meanwhile, in his lifetime, it certainly spoke to us, and he was also a great ambassador for poetry. He took it out there into the world. And that's why he's such a huge presence at the end of the century.